Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather here with the Advancing Equity Coalition with our esteemed guest, Dr. Bernadette Johnson, former superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools. How are y'all doing this morning?
I'm doing fabulous, Kenneth. Thank you and Heather for having me.
Yeah. Heather, how are you doing?
Great. So good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thrilled to be here to hear about Bernadette's experiences.
Yeah. So let's just get right into it. So last week, Heather and I had the opportunity to talk a little bit about our campaign around teacher equity and why the equitable distribution of teachers is such an important issue, right? And we know now, if you've watched our video, you know that what we have in Minneapolis are, patterns of harmful racist movement amongst our teachers, right? We see teachers start in North Minneapolis and continuously try to move towards whiteness and wealth as a trend, right? And these trends we see them across all kinds of issues and sectors, right? We see how these trends replicate in terms of unemployment and violence and health and all of these different things, right? And so this is a really important conversation to have. And so we thought it would be awesome to have, Superintendent Johnson join us to talk about this issue as a former system leader of Minneapolis Public Schools at multiple levels, everywhere from classroom teacher to principal, and then ultimately, obviously, superintendent, just to talk about how do we address this issue? What did she try to do? And how can we really talk about this and think about it differently? And so Superintendent Johnson's just so thankful that you can be here today. And so we want to start with this, you were a principal in Minneapolis Public Schools. What is the impact of having quality teachers in your building? What is the impact of some of the policies that we currently have in place in Minneapolis Public Schools around moving teachers? How did you experience that as a principal yourself?
So as a principal who started in Minneapolis, I would tell you that a lot of the systems were antiquated and did not take in consideration the leadership wants and needs for the building, as well as the whole community and the school community. And so I can share with you a couple of examples that really formed my opinion about what I need to do as a superintendent. Yeah. So a couple of them was that I experienced as a principal, people being placed in my school, walked down the hall one time just to kind of greet the teachers and say, welcome back. I'm excited about the school year. Are you excited? And I meet this guy, he introduces himself. I'm gonna call him Bob. And I said, well, hi, Bob, how are you? He said, fine. I said, how can I help you? He said, well, I'm your new third grade teacher. Never met Bob, didn't know anything about him, didn't know where he taught, didn't know his interests, expertise, or his mindset. None of that mattered to the system. What mattered to the system is that he had a seniority number that told him that he could come to Hall School. And the thing that was even more troubling about that, to be honest, is that I was a new principal in Minneapolis Public Schools. I had tried reaching out to Bob because I knew he had been assigned, but I never met him. I called, I sent letters and everything I want to have a conversation with you about the school community. He didn't follow up. He didn't call, he didn't check in, he didn't do anything. And guess why not? He didn't have to, because he was guaranteed a position. He didn't have to come in and share his expertise or knowledge with me or interests. And I'm not talking about whether you like the Vikings or anything. I'm talking about what do you believe at your core about the children you're going to be working with?
Yeah.
No, nothing. And I'm like, oh yeah, I know this name, but never met him. That should never happen in an environment that's committed to excellence. That should never happen in an environment that is committed to equitable practices for students in school communities. So all that helped for me, helped form how I think about teachers and teacher placement, though I have some other stories that are equally troubling, because I was in a school environment where people really didn't want to come and teach. And so part of my job was to convince people through my acts and personality, etc., that this was the environment that they wanted to teach in, and that I would be a leader that would be there to support them in their quest to be great teachers. Yeah. And so I've been in environments where they call it the excess teachers, where you go to an environment and the teachers kind of walk around like a matching game. I would call it dating, the dating practice. This is a precursor to the dating game that happens now. I don't know. I should shut up. I don't want to talk about what people just talk to each other and decide they want to go on a date. And I did had that experience. I said, no, I'm not interested in any of these people. And it didn't matter.
Mm.
And I think some ways of trying to get me to buy into it, I only had a half-time position. The system said, oh, we'll give them to you full time. I'm like, if I can't deal with them half-time, why would I want them full time? You still have no benefit to me. So the system try to do things to make it palatable, but I wasn't buying it. And I don't believe that any leader worth his or her position buys those same type of shenanigans, to be honest. And they are shenanigans.
Yeah, I think, what your example really demonstrates here is two really clear things to me, and Heather, I'll pass it to you after this. The first one is, the fact that there was a vacancy, right? You tried to get people to come to that school. You tried to get people to fill that vacancy. And, we're talking about Hall. We wouldn't have that vacancy in Burroughs. We would not have that vacancy at Barton. But we had that vacancy at Hall that you cannot fill. And so, it just exists, and it's emblematic of these racist patterns that we see. So then all of a sudden you get Bob, who's placed with you. And again, you have a teacher that is not committed to kids, not committed to building the culture in your building, is not committed to you as a leader. And that's also not good for a school environment. And so we have this harmful policy in order to fill these vacancies that is not good for kids, but is good for adults. Because they don't need to be responsive or whatever, because they will end up with a job. And we have to figure out how we create this, rebalance the system. But Heather, what are your thoughts about, what Superintendent Johnson just shared with us?
Well, as a parent, I've had my children be at a school where we had a music teacher that was placed. And we had an amazing Black principal. And the first thing I remember her saying was, remember, this was not my choice. This was never my choice. And that teacher had a consistent pattern of every time as a volunteer, I'll tell this, for all parents who actually really want to know what happens in Minneapolis public schools, volunteering is like a superpower, because you can find out everything. You really learn a lot about how a school works when you volunteer. But every time I walked past that teacher's classroom, I don't ever remember walking past a time where she didn't have a Black student sitting outside of her room. She intentionally racialized my children multiple times. I'll just tell a quick story. She said to my daughter, if you would sit straighter and quieter and nicer and neater, you could be a 3 music teacher and not a 2. And my daughter, who in all of her 3rd grade wisdom, looked at her and said, I'll take a 2.
Oh, God, sounds like my daughter Brianna. Yes.
So I just think that, all the things that we do to dim the brilliance of the Hatties and Hestons of our system is so traumatic. And, Heather and I literally just came from a protest about a teacher who would come into a building and wear a Trump mask on the anniversary of George Floyd's death. When we have things like placement in place, like that just increases the likelihood that will happen, right? Because you, as a principal at Hall, tried to reach out to this principal or this teacher, and we couldn't talk to them. You had no understanding of what their mindset is. And so, I might end up in a building with a teacher that would do something like that. And we are also preserving their jobs in order to do something like that. And so I think that's really problematic as well, as opposed to, like, if you have a conversation with them, you can maybe suss out, maybe this is not the environment for you if you're
exactly.
Right. And so I think that's really important to acknowledge as well.
It really is. And you end up, you see the consequences of it. You end up, the person comes in and he or she, let's say Bob doesn't connect even with the other teachers, and they're kind of isolated because I have these other committed teachers who are trying to do the best thing they can for students. And Bob closes his door, but he opens it to push kids out, of course. And it was just horrific. It just makes it so much more challenging, because the next year, if Bob is still there and you haven't helped him, exit the system, he'll end up in another school. He probably may not be selected, be in another school. We called it Dancing in Lemons when I was a superintendent. I don't know if that still exists, Dancing in Lemons. And if he did stay another year, So it's how do you balance the parents who say, I don't want my child in his room. You
Mm.
realize that's the only other room you have.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very problematic for the leader to figure out how to keep the community intact around what's going on and how to continue to provide the support, like the professional development support to the Bobs of the world, making sure that you try to develop him up into his position and his role, and hoping that, you know, by your example as a leader and other teachers, that he starts to understand that these kids are worthy
Yeah.
of his excellent stuff. And so all of that takes a lot of time and attention. And in the meantime, while you're focusing on Bob, who you never selected, you have great teachers who are being recruited to go other places. And one of the things I had to share with my principal, our superintendent, you have to tell the high performing teachers, the teachers that are making it with the students and doing a great job, that I appreciate you being here and I want you to stay here. Because they can escape and go to a school environment where it may be less challenging and the needs may not be as great. And so the part of the leader is really complex. You have to develop the people that who need the development, and the people who are the high flyers, you have to let them know you appreciate what they do. And I had to challenge some of my teachers to say, the teacher next door to you is not doing as well. You cannot ignore him. You have to show him and work with him and help him understand he's now at Hall and he has to give his best as well as you. So it really is a complex conversation, but it's one that's necessary and needed. And well, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I can imagine that not only is it challenging for, you know, the leader and the students, but, you know, it's also challenging to have my colleague be placed. And I know that they weren't invited here. And I guess I'm curious from your perspective, how does that, not from just the leader perspective and how it's impacting students, because those are also equally important, but how does it impact the rest of the culture of the building amongst the staff?
Well, I think from my experience, I've had teachers who have reached out and tried to share strategies, especially around things like setting up the right climate for learning. Mm-hmm. I've seen that happen, but I've also seen people like, well, the district shouldn't have put him here. He doesn't belong here, and just kind of close their doors as well and give up. But ultimately, the person becomes a little ostracized. I had a teacher who was placed, there was a vacancy, and the teacher had spent 20 years of being a Supt, which means she was working in a small environment with, you know, small groups of students. She wanted to be a fourth grade teacher. So that was her dream. She wanted to be a fourth grade teacher. She had the license, but she had never taught. So when they placed her there, and there was another Supt, I had a Supt position. So I tried to convince her to come into Hall if she really wanted to be there and thought that was a place for her. Come in as a Supt, because I have a Supt position open, but not as a fourth grade teacher, because you've never managed a full classroom. Right. And trust me, I know my school environment and what I need. And she was upset with me about that and contacted the union and said I was trying to not give her the job that she was placed in. And of course, I had to back off. So she got the job. I still gave her the support, but it was torture for the whole school environment for those students. And for her, I could see her unraveling during the school year. I could see her own sense of self-worth change. And it was because she was not willing to listen to me when I was sharing what the school needed. And she, at the end of the year, she got out of there. She got out of there. She could have probably come in and been a Supt, developed some skills and some relationships with the school community, and would have been successful at that school, at Hall. Yeah. But she said, no, I want to be a teacher. I've been being a Supt for 20 years. I always want to be a classroom teacher. And I'm like, I understand having a passion for what you always want to do, but I'm telling you, the context is this environment. And she had come from a school, low poverty, you know, low students of color. And I was just saying, for me, transitioning to a school like Hall, and I want you to be successful. I certainly want my students to be successful. Right. I'm going to recommend that you apply and ask for this job as a Supt. Yeah. And let somebody else come be bumped in as a fourth grade teacher. No. And that is very problematic when people outside the school who have no experience in the school building are telling you what you need. And Kenneth, Heather, this would lead me to my shift agenda. I just felt like the whole system needed to shift. Now, and the reaction to that was kind of interesting. Now I didn't say fresh start because in my head, I thought the whole system should be fresh started. And you know what that does? So
Right.
I said, no, let's just shift. Let's shift the way we think. Let's shift our systems. Let's shift what we're doing in order to be responsive to the needs of our students, our school community, and our professionals. That was what shift was made. That's why shift was created.
Yeah.
There's another way of kind of invigorating and putting some excitement and change into the system to do things differently because what we were doing wasn't working.
Yeah. So, I just want to say one thing before we move, because I think shift is a really important thing to talk about. Because I think this is one of the first time, or not, I don't say the first time, but it was maybe the most recent time actually that we really tried to tackle this issue around equitable distribution of teachers. But one thing that I wanted to note is, we talk about this like racist movement pattern that we've created in Minneapolis public schools for teachers. I also think about like, when we say that, right, and we say this is based on teacher choice and all of these different things, I understand that it makes it sound like, oh, teachers are making racist choices, but also like, what is our system doing to reinforce those choices and to make those choices make sense, right? Like, I don't want to be in a building where I know that somebody was placed here and I know that they make my school community challenge. And so, yeah, I'm going to move to a boroughs where there's never placed teachers and the school leader can pick, and really design the school community and the school culture in the same way. And yeah, then there also on top of that might be less challenges and there might be, less of a need. And so like it make all those things combine to make my job easier. But our system also reinforces this racism that takes place in these racist movement patterns. And, just by circumstance and by the ways that our institutions and historical racism has, shaped our system, like those racist, like the ways that we've locked in policy and we've make choices about adults over kids, like that disproportionately happens in, North Minneapolis, right? In high concentration of poverty, high concentration of students of color, and does not happen in Southwest. Southwest has more choice and more freedom. North has fewer options, less freedom, and then has to take the leftovers, which is just heartbreaking.
And what we referred to it at the time as churn. You have more churn in North Minneapolis. So the systems like the Bruce Vento Act that kept students in their schools, so if they were homeless, they could still stay in home school. They didn't have to move to a new school community. And we didn't have it. And then so you had this churn of students, you had the churn of teachers, and it just, all those things exacerbate the instruction and what you're trying to do in terms of improving achievement for students. And so I think the savvy leader, and yes, I was counting myself as one of those, you have to look at every nook and corner to see where there's inequities, where things are not working, and see what you can do to change those or shift those, and by language, shift those to serve the student population that's here. The systems that were set up, I say are archaic, they were set up back in the days like the whole calendar is agrarian, based on the agrarian calendar, people farming. So the fact of the matter is that the systems have not changed to meet the needs and be prepared to accept and accelerate the achievement of the students least served, because it wasn't designed to do that. And so how do we make our systems more nimble? If you're not nimble, you can't. Eric Mahmoud, his math scores were down. He decided that he's gonna have his kids come an extra hour. I would have had to go through 10 hours of negotiations, etc. And so school districts are not very nimble. They're not very insightful sometimes, and they just don't act. And so there's like these canaries in the mines all over the city, and you see these things popping up, but you're not able to weave it together to create a story about what's happening in a way that compels people as well to change and to do things differently.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. Heather, again, having two Black children in Minneapolis public schools and kind of hearing this, what's your reaction to some of the challenges that we've talked about at a very policy level, and we knew it related to people's experiences, but to hear it, in the day-to-day experience of Dr. Johnson, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we have is a system that really allows adults multiple chances and multiple avenues and multiple lanes to children that they aren't prepared to keep safe and help learn to grow. And I've seen my children experience that directly. I've seen other students of color, and I'll just name that for as many times as I've, talked to, had experiences with, seen teachers do really egregious things. I haven't yet seen the district, the principals, respond in a way that actually cared for the student of color that was harmed, and to take like meaningful action so that that student didn't have to go back into that same space again. And then the last thing that I'll say, one thing that's the most bothersome to me is that I think I've seen restorative practices often get used against and be weaponized against the very students that they are designed to be help empowering. And we were a part of a restorative circle where the entire time the leader of the circle just kept saying, I know you think you heard the teacher say that, but the teacher didn't say that. Well, that's not restorative. That's actually abusive.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
And so, yeah, so I do have, I think me, I'm always going to come back to the tactical, to the in real life, to like the experience I see right now. And I think that we need to have a much more holistic conversation about how we value students and their experience, and then what are we asking of the adults that we're paying in order to make that happen.
Yeah. So Dr. Johnson, you mentioned shift. So let's rewind, right? Like explain shift to us, right? Like what was that?
So shift was a campaign. If people, think about campaigns, it was a campaign to, first of all, communicate my beliefs and thinking as a leader, to introduce to the community ways that I was thinking about changing the system, to get some buy-in. So, because, usually what happens, you sit in the exec session or you sit in your study session, you talk about it, and you may make comments at a board meeting, but I wanted to be something that would just kind of excite people, energize people, and also put people on notice that we weren't going to continue to do things the way we did to. So there were things like at Interview and Select, the teachers wouldn't be placed. There would be interviewing teachers, because the selection process is a really sacred process. It means a lot to the overall school community and how well students do. So that was really a big part of it. The other part was I was looking at autonomies, how schools can have autonomies. So let's take this interview and selection process where teachers and students, teachers and students as well could participate, and the leader could go outside the system to identify the best teacher for the school. So you weren't locked into the people who are already on contract with the Minneapolis Public Schools. If you found someone who could come in and do what we needed within the school, that school leader and that school community could hire outside the system. So it was also foreshadowing for the community what I was interested in doing in contract negotiations. So like the Interview and Select, so knowing and understanding that things would not happen right away, that it would take a period of time, but just kind of putting it out there, and that schools would be open and they would be centers for the community to use. There were a lot of complex things. I removed entry requirements for high level courses and get kids who have the interest and the high need and give them school support. So a lot of intricacies, but most of it was around negotiations, I believe. Is that how do we talk about this? Because you can talk about programs, you talk about IB, you talk about all the magnet programs. It really comes down to the people. It's the people, not the programs. Because people run programs, people run schools. And so your investment in people, and people that like to use it, like the human capital is real in organizations. Target and Cargill, they're not hiring subpar people. If they need somebody for their organization, they hire them. Now the unions pushback on that would be, we want to make sure we have fair wages and all. I agree. I think people should have fair wages. I believe teachers should be paid more. I don't disagree with some of that, but we have to figure out how to balance what professionals need and how we treat them as professionals and what our students deserve. And all of those, they can't be in conflict with one another. So I understand how So working with the unions to get interview and select and do some of those other things, those autonomies. And I started out with 5 schools. I don't think they're in existence anymore. So I
Yeah.
don't know if those schools can still do that. And then you had tricks. You had people who would go to South High School to say they want to teach an all nations program. And then they were allowed, so they were treated as a school within a school, all nations. They want to work with Native students. And then after they got there, they really wanted to be at South High School. So then they were allowed to leave all nations to go to South High School. So it's just all these ways that people come up, very creative ways of trying to get what they want. And I'm just like, I'm no less creative. Let me go with some creative ways to get what I want and need to serve the children that are least served in the system.
Yeah.
And that's for all students. All students deserve that. And in Minneapolis, some students have it and some don't. And that's the fact. It's a fact.
So I think, I'll say that I grew up, quote unquote, in my education advocacy journey under you primarily as the superintendent, right? And so I'm very used to your style of leadership. I'm very used to kind of like how you like to go about doing things. And I know that you and I have not agreed on everything, and I have made that clear, and you have made that clear, and so I think that's fine. But I do think what I've always appreciated is the fact that you are willing to take your thoughts and your ideas public. And again, sometimes, even though when you did that, I criticized, and when you did that, I appreciated, right? But I think that's important as an important step as a leader. Is to come out and be public. Now we know that, and we've heard feedback now from different folks that right now, the way that we're talking about contract negotiations should not be talked about publicly, right? Like some of the things that we're like the things that should be talked about in contract negotiations should just be held in negotiation. And so what was your experience as a leader, right, guys? Because I just think that was a different tactic that you took.
Oh, it was a different tactic. And so one of the things I promised, so here's the first thing. The schools belong to the community and the people who send their kids to Minneapolis public schools. And I agreed right away that I would never close negotiations, that they would always be open. And I received a notice from the Bureau of Mediation that the union had requested that the negotiations get closed.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like that. And I contacted them and I said, and they were going to close them. I said, well, how can you close them when you only talk to one side? I was never engaged in the conversation, never asked. I mean, I made public that I would never close them. And so they were closed because the union requested it. And so I was very open. So I even went one step further during shift. I decided that people needed, I put my whole salary out there. I put the base, I started talking about salaries. I just talk about just the base. I talked about salary plus benefits. And that was shocking to people. They had never seen that. I mean, so the fact of the matter is that your taxes. I just moved to Minneapolis and I knew I was moving here with a higher tax base because I don't mind contributing to the schools. But I also know that there has to be some level of accountability and it can't be secrecy. There has to be transparency and put the sunlight on it so people can know. Now, was that challenging sometimes? Absolutely. And I mean, but it was challenging, but ultimately I felt really good about people being able to sit in and observe. And I got pushed back at people who say, well, you shouldn't have done that type of thing. But I was convicted. I was convinced that being transparent was the right way to go. And keep in mind, it was also a part of the shift. No longer was things cloaked. No longer were doors closed. No longer were we going to keep going with practices that didn't benefit professionals and students. And so that was my way of shifting everything. And it just kind of startled everyone. But in a way, I thought that made people think, oh, shit, she's serious about this. This is some serious stuff.
Yeah. And so Heather, I think it's been made clear to us, like that this is not the environment that we're operating under right now in terms of, weighing in on any issue talking about teachers, right? Like we have not had a substantive conversation about teaching and instruction in Minneapolis public schools since September of 2019. And even that was like a flash in the pan. Like that was very surprising. And that was, but years before that, we still hadn't talked about it. And so what are your reflections around what we're experiencing now in terms of, how do we have this conversation? Because it just feels like we need to have this conversation. It's on the top of people's minds. And also we're just not having that publicly with our leaders. And so, I just love to hear your reflections on that as well.
Yeah, what some of the things that I've heard from different school board members is this kind of idea like, oh, we can't talk about negotiations publicly and about our responsibility as civil servants publicly because we're in current contract negotiations. Now, here, I'll just say this though, we have a pattern of being in contract negotiations for about 18 months out of every 2-year cycle. So so I guess I just don't understand. Are we supposed to wait until this 18 months is done and not have any input? So I, as a parent whose children have never had a student of color, or I'm sorry, a teacher of color, right? I, as a parent, need to be quiet about my desire for that and about my role in that and what we are going to do about that until sometime out there when we all of a sudden are going to be, that's going to be the time that we're going to be allowed to talk about it. So I don't think that that's how you initiate change. I think we have a conversation in our city that we're scared to have. And I think that the students of color of our city need us to be more courageous.
Yeah. They do. It's interesting, guys, because boards you can't negotiate in public. I mean, so that is a true thing, but nothing stops you from sharing your aspirations for the organization you lead. So that's the way I took it. And so I was trying to be very strategic because I've been out there and saying stuff and I've got my coattails pulled back, like, come back. Whoa, Nellie, we're not there yet. And so I sat down with my board and I went through every one of the elements of the shift agreement and I had them vote on it in executive session. It wasn't out, but I wanted to know that I will be the voice out there. When I'm doing this, I want to know when I get to the negotiations table, I want to know you have my back. I want to know that you believe in this. And if you did have my back, I want to know that you've heard this and you believe and you understand the direction that I'm going in. And that's the difference for me. So I'm sorry, I don't know how you lead an organization if you don't espouse your beliefs and your values and what you aspire to do. And so, yes, you could talk about, and I did talk about the reading and the over-reliance on sending kids to special ed and suspensions and all that. I talked about all that as well. But the fact of the matter is that, again, it comes down to the people. If you have folks in front of students who don't believe in their capacity, who believe everything they do is criminal, and I'm not saying every teacher in Minneapolis is like that. And so every time I do this, I have to say, I was successful at Holland getting some badass teachers. I mean, like fire ass, good teachers. And I'm very proud of those teachers. And I work with them still. And we didn't agree on everything, but they came in and they believed in those kids and they did everything they could to establish those relationships and those communities that matter for students. Now, we still weren't doing as well as we needed to do, but we certainly weren't the worst in the state as we had started out being. Yeah. And it all matters. It all matters on who the leaders can hire. And then you got to have the right leaders in the school who can do that. So let's don't leave leaders out of this. All of this matters. Everybody in the organization matters.
Yeah.
But
I just think that, coming back to Heather's point a little bit is like, yeah, understood. The board cannot negotiate in public, but that doesn't mean that we can't talk about some of the biggest pressing issues in our district, right? And so I'm not saying like we need to negotiate the contract in public. What I am saying though is like we need at least to be able to talk about this issue that was brought to the board around teacher equity and say like, hey, we are having trouble with this. Here's the progress that we've made in terms of what we've done so far. Here's not what we've done. Here's what we've not done so far. And here are some things that we need to look at, right? And that doesn't mean like, let's go down and like, that is a negotiation, but that's just being transparent with your community and your tax base around what are the problems and what are the issues, because we know that this is an issue. And if we actually believe that teachers are the most important resource in a classroom, we can't keep going 2 or 3 years without ever talking about them publicly, right? Like, that is a must, an absolute must.
It's an absolute must. And the thing that's really disconcerting and troubling about it is the fact that we also have people who are politicians, and they go for the endorsement of the union. And so what starts to happen is that the union is stronger than the community in this regard. And so you have community board members go out to the community and talk, and they get, people say, well, I support, like I was on the African American Leadership Forum for a while. ALF supports you, but if the union doesn't support you, you don't get the vote. And I mean, it really is. I mean, you get the publication. I mean, there's a lot that comes with that. So the savvy board member figures out, they feel like they need that endorsement to become a board member in terms of the resources they need, but how to also have a strong spine when it comes to what's needed for the students. Because otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah. Well, in your experience, what was your, you announced Shift, it became, public. Then what was the reaction from the union when you announced it and everything like that?
Well, I mean, it was interesting. And the union president at the time, Lynn Norgan, and I've known each other for years. And there were some things that she didn't necessarily like about it, but we met every week. And so it was every week, every month. Now I can't remember, but we met frequently and talked about it. And so there were some trade-offs. There's some things that I was willing to do to get her support around some of the things. But I think the thing when I did the Shift agenda, what was most surprising and shocking and made me feel really good is every board member was on the front row, lined up on the front row as I was giving that speech. And that was important. And so, it wasn't a surprise. I told people I was going to do it. So I told the union, I didn't want to surprise them so that they can, figure out how they were going to respond. So I think, when you sit down and talk to teachers, now I'm talking about teachers, not the union. When you separate the teachers from the union, that was also one of my strategies, to be present in schools, to talk to teachers. I go on this listening tour and a speaking tour about Shift. So I would do homeroom with Superintendent Johnson. I would just show up at the school. What do you want to talk about? Yeah. I'm not coming to school. I'm not closing your school. I'm not losing your principal. I'm not cutting your budget. Let's just talk about what's needed. And so that was one way I tried to combat some of that, is that to talk directly to the teachers. And then to the community, I started the leader letter that I would put out every time I was doing something. So people in the community, when they were approached about what I was doing, that they could speak eloquently and knowledgeably about what I was saying and doing. So they didn't have to kind of run back and call somebody like, what is she talking about? I put it out there. Another way to be transparent and open. So to me, I thought it worked, but yeah, you don't have to go.
Right. And so I want to create the space and acknowledge, right? Like, this was what you put forward. That was a strategy that you took. So some of Shift came to fruition, but then went away super quickly. So a criticism that could be lodged back at you is like, well, what you did didn't create long lasting change. And so looking at, Superintendent Graff and looking at our current board, and then also our current union leadership and principals and every other power broker within Minneapolis Public Schools, what would you say that they should replicate about your work? But also, what would you say they should do differently in order to make sure that the change is long lasting and we actually see better results for our students of color?
Well, so Kenneth, this is a tricky one because, quite frankly, leaders come in and they want to make their own mark and do whatever they want. I would like to say I was less interested in that. First of all, I came in as a deputy superintendent. I came in as the chief academic officer, and then I was a deputy superintendent. I was a superintendent. So I had an investment in everything we're doing. There's no reason I mean, new superintendents come in probably based on a change agenda, based on what people didn't like about the previous superintendent. Not everyone likes Shift. Not everyone liked me talking about teachers or displaying salaries on the website. Not everyone liked me not keeping negotiations open. Not everyone liked all the things that I did. And so that's what happens with leadership. It happens in the presidency, it happens at the city council, it happens in the school. It's just what happens. Yeah. And so what it takes is, if there are still board members on the board who still feel correct, believe that the work had potential or was seeing some traction, then they have to say that's important. But when a new school board or the board runs on the thing that everything that Bernadette did was wrong and there was nothing right about it, then there's no reason for the current superintendent to change what he's doing. He comes in with his own agenda. And here's where it creates problems for the teachers, and where they do have a right to push back. So Bernadette said this, and Ed said this, and Dr. Green said this, and you know what, we have 150 initiatives on our plate, and we don't know which ones to pay attention to. Will you pay attention to, take my word for it, you pay attention to the current superintendent. But the fact of the matter is that it creates all this junk that people are doing. And then you have people working at cross purposes. And even if people, you as superintendent board members who are currently serving, who were there when I was there, I mean, I had to push a lot of those board members to agree with me. You know, they didn't necessarily agree, but I think they finally realized she has something here. You know, so if you believed that what we were doing wasn't working, and you had the data to show you that, then you had nothing to lose to go with Bernadette's plan, really. So, but while they were still in power, while I was still there, but then at some point, you know, stuff happens, and I left. And, you know, and there were reasons I left, mostly to do with my family, who, you know, and it's interesting. My grandmother died first. No, my grandfather did. My grandmother died. Somebody said, "Oh, your grandparents were really sick." I said, "I would not lie about my grandparents being ill." So I've had a lot of death, and I'm glad I made the decision to leave. But in a perfect world, in my perfect world, just like the superintendent out in Denver, he told his kids they would live overseas a couple of years. His board allowed him to take a leave of absence, go live in another country. They had an interim serving while he was gone, and he came back to his job. It's in Colorado. I don't know if it's Denver, Colorado Springs. I can't remember. I think it was Denver. And I was just sitting there thinking, like, well, my grandma's sick. They said, "Okay, when are you resigning?" You know, so it's just like I was a pain in the butt to them, I'm sure, because everybody didn't like it. And even the people who I thought would appreciate it and knew what I was trying to do it didn't speak up. They were quiet. And so why would they try to ask me to stay or ask to keep me if, and I'm talking about all communities. I'm not talking about white communities, I'm talking about Black communities, I'm talking about Native communities, I'm talking about all communities. You know, people show up for the going away party, but they weren't necessarily showing up. I mean, they spoke up to shifts, but I mean, when you see the craziness going on, everybody was silent.
Yeah.
So as much as people say they want change, they're comforted by the status quo. It rewards them in some way. Rewards them in ways that they don't have to act. They don't have to get into disagreements. And a little healthy tension is not bad.
Yeah.
A little healthy disagreement. That's why I talk to you still. I mean, seriously. I mean, I remember sitting down, and I would sit down and talk to people. And so, you know, and then people thought, well, I was accused of everything. People that I never heard. You must be in bed with the Kochs. I didn't know who the Kochs were. I still don't think I know who they are. And I'm like, I never talked to a Koch. I don't know who they are. I mean, so, and that was you who accused me of that. I mean, so I was accused of everything demonic and weird to hurt kids, when in my heart and my knowledge, I felt like I was trying to establish systems and processes that supported kids, especially our kids who the system deserved the least. And it's just interesting. And I don't think people really knew the work that I was doing, you know, around mental health, you know, suspensions, you know, but that teacher thing, talk about teachers.
Yeah. So you gave a very polite and respectful answer, so we'll accept that. But I would, you know, ask Heather, you know, as a current parent, again, you know, what would you like this current administration to replicate from, you know, Dr. Johnson's leadership, right? Like, what would you like to see from our current leadership right now in the district? I feel like we might have lost Heather though. Yeah, you left and came back. Hi. Are you there, Heather?
So something's happening.
Yeah, we might have lost Heather briefly, but what I'll say is, like I said, was that?
No, I was going to say, so replicate is interesting because, so replicate, if they had kept the interview select, and down to the next iteration that I had defined. So, so it's, yeah, they should, I mean, there's the autonomies for sure. I believe when schools feel empowered, when leaders feel empowered, and they work with their school community, which includes the teachers, the students, the parents, the faith-based organizations, when you have those autonomies, you're able to create the learning environment for the community you're serving. And the reason I moved to that point is because I realized as a superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools, I didn't know the context for every learning environment. I didn't know what every school needed. And the approach that the systems use is one that's easy for systems, is automatic, is replicable, it's the exact same thing, which doesn't take in consideration the needs of each school, just like you want teachers to take in consideration the needs of each student. So systems will always go with what helps systems. And to break off a set of autonomous schools from the system was like a step too far for me, I guess, because I'm just like, these are the schools, and I wanted to start with high priority schools. It was interesting, Southwest applied to be one, and I wasn't ready for high performing schools. I felt like they already had autonomies. So the schools that I chose were the schools who really wanted to use their own autonomies, to hire the teachers they needed, to use the resources in ways that made sense. So they had 5 autonomies: staffing, budgeting, scheduling, curriculum, and I can't remember the 5. I think maybe it was governance, but it doesn't make sense now. But it was 5. I should go back and look at it. Yeah, they had 5 autonomies.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, though, is just like what I really appreciated just in the leadership style, at the very least, was like your willingness to come to the public, right? And we know you're really personable and everything like that, but just like the willingness to bring things to the public and let the public have a conversation, let the public have a discourse about it, right? And create that healthy tension. And you can get the feedback whether, no, this does not make sense, or whether this does make sense. And, you know, you get a sense of, right, like then you have the ability to work with Lynn outside of contract negotiations to figure out what should be brought to the table, right? And so I just think that those are all important things. And to let we understand that, the union has a lot of political power, but the will of the people can also build power. And so I think that was an important thing. And just, I would say, me personally, I think that it's a really important characteristic of a leader to do it this way. And I think that we're doing a disservice right now to not have any conversation about, how are we defining quality teachers? How are we measuring that? How are we, just getting rid of problematic, antiquated systems like placement and just different things like that. I think those are all things that need to be part of public discourse that's not about contract negotiations, but does have to do with teachers, right? And there are things that the district can be doing outside of the contract to like creating better incentives within working conditions in buildings and all these different types of things. And so I just think that all of it has to be a part of a public conversation and public discourse.
So leadership matters in this case. And so I decided that I would become very familiar with the teacher's contract because I was tired of people telling me what I couldn't do. And the words that really matter, shall, can, and may, all those little words mean a heck of a lot. And so you have to decide that I'm a rule follower. So I wasn't breaking any rules, but I had to figure out ways of positioning what I wanted to do in a way that I don't think I had a grievance of ever doing anything wrong against the contract. And then I also tell school leaders, if people are listening to this, is the fact of the matter, don't negotiate your managerial rights away.
Mm-hmm.
That is the worst thing you can do. If you're running an organization, it's not that you can't be respectful of people and do all the things that are necessary and important, like fair wages and working conditions that are respectful, professional, and safe, but do not. The Minneapolis contract is probably one of the largest contracts I know in the state of Minnesota. And over the years, leaders have given away their managerial rights to tell people, to direct people and have them do what they do. And it's sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and we need to take risks because we don't know how it's going to push back on us. And so I just got to the point like, well, hell, they hate me anyway. So, I mean, you have to figure out, you have to come to a point in time when you say, this is more important than my position. This is more important than keeping the job. And that's a hard thing to do when you're raising a family and you're doing those kind of things. So I have no deep I have no deep criticism of people except to say, step outside of your comfort. Do things you can do more than you think you can do. And that's why I tell people leadership matters. Where you are, where you're present, what you say and how you do it, all that matters.
100%. And so now that we have Heather back, we'll close with you,
Sorry
Heather.
about that.
No, it's fine. We were just, as a parent, what would you like to see replicated and shared from now Superintendent Johnson to Superintendent Graff?
Yeah, I'd like to see the student participatory evaluators and their student forms and feedbacks. I actually would like to see those become more meaningful, become something that matters, something that's not just a thing that we do. I think that we often waste the energy of Black students, students of color, families of color, by having them fill out feedback that is just lip service.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd love to see parent participatory evaluators become part of something meaningful in the process, instead of just this thing that we do where you invite people and people fill it out and then we go right back to doing what we were going to do on a Tuesday anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Any last, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, the best evaluator or the best person to give you feedback on a teacher is the student in the classroom, because they know what's happening. So this is one of the things I did too. I introduced student evaluation to be included in the teacher evaluation, student feedback. And I worked with Ron Ferguson out of Harvard to do that. And I had kindergarten students doing it, and people just lost their minds. Kindergarten kids don't know. I'm like, my grandson's 4 years old. He can tell you he thinks about a lot of stuff. So I just feel like leadership matters. This content and this topic matters. I'm very pleased to see that you guys are still talking about it, and great to see you, Kenneth, and still in a leadership role doing this, and nice to connect with Heather as well. This is necessary work and it's important work. And I'm here if you need me in any way to help. And this is my way of giving back to Minneapolis, is participating in this process, this dialogue this morning.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, Superintendent Johnson. We appreciate you, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so very much.
Bye, all.
And keep me posted.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.